A wealthy widow walked into a boardroom with a janitor. What happened next left millionaires stunned. The atmosphere inside the Lexington Corp boardroom was suffocating tense with the weight of expectation. This wasn't just another quarterly meeting. This was the moment when fortunes would shift, alliances would be tested, and power would change hands. The kind of meeting where billionaires measured their words like currency and every glance carried an unspoken deal. But no one was prepared for what happened next. When Vivian Lancaster walked in, the room fell into a hushed silence. Her entrance was deliberate, her heels striking the polished mahogany floors with an effortless authority that made even the most seasoned executives rethink their confidence. She had inherited this empire after the sudden passing of her husband, but if anyone thought she would be a fragile, grieving widow easily manipulated, they were sorely mistaken. Yet, it wasn't just her presence that made the air crackle with tension. It was the man walking beside her. Miguel wasn't dressed in a custom suit. He didn't carry a Mont Blanc pen or check the time on a Patek Philippe. His uniform was a navy blue janitor's jumpsuit, the company logo barely visible after years of wear. In his rough, calloused hand, he still clutched a utility rag as if he had been interrupted mid-task. The silence deepened. The millionaires at the table exchanged bewildered looks. Who was this man? And more importantly, why was he here? Vivian took her seat at the head of the table. With a measured glance, she surveyed the room, then gestured for Miguel to sit beside her. And then, in a voice as sharp as a scalpel, she said the words that would change everything. Silence. The tension in the room thickened, turning the air heavy with unspoken questions. Executives shifted in their seats, exchanging puzzled glances, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The CFO, Richard Alden, finally found his voice. He cleared his throat, plastering on a well-practiced, diplomatic smile. "Mrs. Lancaster, I." Vivian raised a manicured hand, cutting him off before he could dig himself into a deeper hole. "I invited him." Miguel shifted uncomfortably beside her. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed downward as if he wished he could disappear. The weight of the room pressed on him, and he knew without a doubt that he didn't belong here. And yet, here he was. The executives were waiting for an explanation, their patience running thin. This was supposed to be a high-stakes corporate meeting: shareholders, financial reports, strategic projections, the kind of gathering where fortunes were built and broken, where the scent of old money mixed with expensive cologne and hand-rolled cigars. Not janitors. Vivian lowered herself into the leather chair at the head of the long glass table. She crossed one leg over the other, surveying the room with the kind of quiet amusement that only the truly powerful could afford. She let the discomfort linger, stretching the silence until it became unbearable. And then, finally, she spoke. "I know what you're all thinking," she said, her tone smooth as silk. "And I don't care. No one in that room could have predicted what was coming next." Miguel felt the heat of a dozen stares boring into him. He was used to being invisible, just another worker passing through the hallways, sweeping up after people who never gave him a second glance. But to day, every single person in that boardroom was looking at him, like he was something foreign, like he was something impossible. Like he was the last thing they ever expected to see in this room. And yet, here he was. Miguel shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around the rag in his hands. He didn't belong here. He knew it. They knew it. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to get up and leave. But Vivian Lancaster wasn't about to let that happen. She leaned forward, her fingers laced together on the table, the hint of a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I'm sure some of you are wondering why I asked Miguel to be here today," she said, letting her gaze travel slowly across the room, daring anyone to challenge her. "Well, let me tell you a story. A few weeks ago, she had been walking past the employee break room on the 9th floor, a floor she rarely visited. She had been on her way to a high-level strategy meeting, mind focused on billion-dollar deals, when something unusual caught her ear. It wasn't the typical break room chatter. No complaints about workloads, no small talk about weekend plans. It was a conversation about investments. She slowed her pace. At first, she assumed one of her analysts had wandered in by mistake. But the voice was unfamiliar, steady, deliberate, filled with the kind of confidence that came from experience, not textbooks. Curious, she stepped closer. "No, that stock's a bad play right now," the voice said. "It's got short-term gains, but if you track the market indicators, the real money is in undervalued assets. Look at what happened in '08. People got greedy, thought they could ride the momentum, but the smart ones, they knew where to put their money after the collapse." Vivian raised an eyebrow. She peered through the half-open door and saw Miguel, sitting at the worn-out lunch table, gesturing with his hands as he explained market strategies to another janitor. She watched, listened for 15 minutes. She stood there, unnoticed, completely absorbed. He broke down market cycles like it was second nature. He explained how certain businesses were positioned for explosive growth while others were ticking time bombs. He talked about risk in a way that wasn't just theory, it was practical, grounded, the way someone who truly understood money would talk. Not like a Wall Street banker trying to sell a dream, but like someone who knew exactly how to build wealth. And in that moment, Vivian Lancaster knew Miguel wasn't just a janitor. He was something else entirely. It didn't make sense. Why was a janitor talking like a hedge fund manager? Vivian didn't hesitate. She stepped into the break room, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the small, fluorescent-lit space. Miguel fell silent the second he saw her. His face paled, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He looked like a kid who had just been caught sneaking into a high-stakes poker game he had no business being in. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady. "Where did you learn all that?" Miguel hesitated. His fingers tapped against the surface of his coffee cup, a nervous tick. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. "My dad owned a small auto shop," he admitted. "He taught me everything he knew about finance, how to stretch a dollar, how to invest smart. When he passed, I had to drop out of college. Couldn't afford it." Vivian studied him for a beat. That was the moment she made up her mind. "I want you to come with me to a meeting next week," she said. "Just sit and listen, and if I ask you something, answer honestly." Miguel blinked. "A meeting with my executives," she clarified. His eyes widened. "I don't think I—" "You don't have to think," she cut in smoothly. "Just show up." Everything in him wanted to say no. He wasn't supposed to be in rooms like that. He wasn't someone who sat at those tables. But something in Vivian's expression told him she wasn't asking. And that's how he ended up here, in a boardroom filled with people waiting for him to fail. But what happened next? Not even Vivian was ready for it. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing against Miguel's chest like a weight. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the slow, deliberate ticking of the antique clock mounted on the far wall. Miguel could feel his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. This wasn't his world. This was a place for people with designer suits and Ivy League diplomas. Not for a janitor who spent his nights pushing a mop down empty hallways. But then, against every logical part of his brain, he stayed. One of the executives, Martin Caldwell, leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his tailored sleeve. His smile was polite, but the condescension beneath it was unmistakable. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, letting out a small, forced chuckle. "I'm sure we all appreciate the ... sentiment, but I assume there's a point to this." Vivian smiled, not the warm kind, the kind that let you know you were playing checkers while she was playing chess. "There is," she said smoothly. "Miguel is here because I want him to weigh in on today's discussion." A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. Richard Alden, the CFO, shifted uncomfortably. His grip on his pen tightened ever so slightly. "With all due respect," he said, carefully measuring his words, "today's agenda involves critical financial strategy. I don't see how he would have any relevant insight." Vivian's smile didn't waver. "That's funny," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Because last week, when I overheard Miguel explaining long-term market positioning, he made more sense than half of you do in these meetings." A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. Richard's jaw tensed. "I'm serious," Vivian continued, her tone calm but sharp. "Miguel has a perspective that I think we could benefit from. And considering the state of our underperforming assets, I'd say we need all the fresh ideas we can get." Martin exhaled sharply through his nose, then turned to Miguel. "All right," he said, voice laced with skepticism. "Then by all means impress us." Silence. Miguel felt it settle over him like a weight. Every pair of eyes locked onto him, waiting, expecting him to stumble. His throat was dry, his palms damp. What was he supposed to say? His mind screamed at him to back out, to get up, to walk away before he made a fool of himself. But then, he remembered the break room conversation, the way he spoke without hesitation, the way the numbers had made sense, and something shifted. Slowly, he straightened in his chair, and then, in a voice steadier than he expected, he spoke. For a brief second, Miguel considered standing up and walking out. But then, he remembered. He thought about his father, the long nights they spent at the worn-out kitchen table, stacks of financial reports spread between them. How his dad would trace market trends with a pencil on yellowed pages, explaining patterns and pitfalls. How they dissected case studies from old business journals his father had picked up for $1 at a second-hand bookstore. He thought about the day his father passed, and how, ever since, all that knowledge, all that understanding had been buried beneath years of mopping floors and taking out the trash. And suddenly, something clicked. Miguel inhaled deeply, then lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Martin. "You're worried about the underperforming assets?" he asked. Martin arched an eyebrow. Obviously, Miguel nodded. But not out of hesitation, out of certainty. He already knew the answer to the question none of these men in expensive suits had been able to solve. "I read the reports," Miguel said, his voice steady now. "The problem isn't the assets, it's how you're evaluating them." A murmur rippled through the room. Martin scoffed. "Oh, and how do you suggest we evaluate them?" Miguel leaned forward slightly, his confidence growing. "The same way a smart investor looks at a company during a recession," he said. "Not by its current value, but by its potential value." The murmuring stopped. The silence that followed wasn't the uncomfortable, dismissive kind. It was the kind that came when people realized they had just heard something important, something they hadn't considered before. Vivian Lancaster watched from her seat, the faintest trace of a smile playing at her lips. Maybe, just maybe, this meeting was about to get interesting. Vivian Lancaster smiled. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. But the real shock came when Miguel started breaking down numbers. Not vague theories, not empty buzzwords. Cold, hard numbers, ones that even the top executives had overlooked. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted. Minutes ago, Miguel had been nothing more than a janitor, a nobody, a man who didn't belong. But now, he had their attention. Real attention. The kind that only comes when people realize they've underestimated someone badly. Martin Caldwell leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. The smug smirk that had been on his face earlier, gone. "All right," he said slowly, his voice measured. "Let's say we evaluate potential value instead of current value. What exactly are we missing?" Miguel exhaled. For years, he had watched executives make decisions from a distance. Had seen them throw around numbers in boardrooms, just like this one, never realizing that the guy pushing the mop actually understood what they were talking about, sometimes better than they did. But this was different. Now he was in the ring. He turned his attention to Richard Alden, the CFO, the logistics division. Miguel said. "That's the problem, right?" Richard blinked. A flicker of something surprise, maybe even discomfort, crossed his face. "How did you?" "I read the reports," Miguel interrupted. His voice was steady, controlled. "You're bleeding money because you're outsourcing distribution instead of optimizing internally." The air in the boardroom grew heavier. Miguel didn't stop. "The cost margins on your third-party contracts have increased by 12% over the last 2 quarters. Meanwhile, your own fleet is running at less than 50% capacity. That means you're paying premium rates for services you already have the infrastructure to handle in-house. Richard shifted in his seat. We ran models that suggested. Your models were built on outdated fuel cost projections and pre-pandemic freight rates. Miguel cut in. His words were sharp, precise. They don't apply anymore. Silence. The kind that came when people weren't just listening, they were realizing. Vivian folded her hands on the table, watching as the room finally caught up to what she had already known. Maybe Miguel didn't have an Ivy League degree, but he had something much more valuable. And in that moment, every executive in that room knew it. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Alyssa Chun, a junior executive, frowned at her tablet, scrolling rapidly through reports. "Wait," she muttered under her breath. "He's right." Miguel didn't pause. "You're sitting on millions in underutilized assets," he said, his voice calm, measured. "Instead of cutting jobs, restructure the distribution model. Use your fleet. Cut outsourcing by 30%. That alone saves you at least $8 million a year." A ripple moved through the room. A senior analyst cleared his throat. "If that's true, then why didn't we see it?" Miguel met his gaze. "You weren't looking for it." A murmur spread across the table. Someone whispered to the person beside them. The executives, who had been dismissive just minutes ago, were now paying attention. Martin Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. And then, finally, Vivian Lancaster spoke. "That's why Miguel is here." Her words settled over the room like a final verdict. Miguel swallowed hard. Had he just changed his life? Or had he just made the biggest mistake of his career, if you could even call this a career? But then, Richard Alden, the CFO, let out a slow breath and leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Can you show us how to implement it?" Miguel hesitated. This was it. The moment he could back down or step up, his fists clenched under the table. Then, with a voice steadier than he expected, he said, "Yes." But no one was prepared for what Vivian Lancaster would say next. The silence stretched thick, heavy. The kind of silence that followed a shift in power. The kind of silence that marked a moment after which nothing would ever be the same. Miguel had done the impossible. He hadn't just spoken up, he had proven them wrong. And now, every single person in that boardroom knew it. Richard Alden ran a hand over his jaw, his skepticism giving way to something more cautious, more calculating. He glanced at Vivian, then back at Miguel. "You're telling me we can cut $8 million in costs just by restructuring logistics?" Miguel nodded once. Alyssa Chun was still scanning through numbers on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen, whispering calculations under her breath. "It actually checks out," she murmured, almost to herself. Another executive leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "And you figured this out just by reading reports?" Miguel hesitated for the briefest of moments. He could feel their eyes on him. These were people who had spent years in corner offices, sitting in high-backed leather chairs, signing deals that shaped industries. They had degrees, networks, generational wealth, and yet, here he was, a janitor, telling them something they should have already known. He chose his words carefully. "I pay attention," he said simply. A few executives exchanged glances. Some impressed, some uneasy, but Vivian? Vivian was smiling. She turned to Richard. "How long have we been looking for a financial consultant?" Richard blinked, caught off guard. 6 months," Vivian nodded. Then, without missing a beat, she looked directly at Miguel. "You want the job?" The air in the room shifted. Miguel stiffened. "What? I'm offering you a job," Vivian repeated, her voice as steady as ever. No hesitation, no theatrics, like she had made this decision long before she even walked into the meeting. "Financial consultant," she said, effective immediately. And just like that, the room erupted. Martin Caldwell's chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood as he shot up from his seat. "Vivian, be serious," he snapped. "You're offering a janitor a consultant position just like that?" Vivian didn't even blink. "Yes, Richard Alden pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling sharply. "With all due respect, this isn't how we hire people. It is today," Vivian cut in smoothly. Martin let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You can't just—" "I own this company," Vivian interrupted, tilting her head slightly. "I can do whatever I want." The room froze. Miguel sat there, stunned, his brain struggling to keep up. A minute ago, he had been the janitor, the guy who scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. Now he was being offered a seat at the table. "I don't even have a degree," Miguel stammered. Vivian waved a hand dismissively. "And half the idiots running billion-dollar hedge funds do." She leaned forward, her gaze locked onto his. "I don't care about degrees, Miguel. I care about results. You saw something no one else in this room did. You solved a problem that's been draining our bottom line for over a year, and I don't reward talent by letting it go to waste." Miguel's palms were sweating. He could barely breathe. "I don't know what to say," Vivian smiled. "Say yes." He should have hesitated. He should have overthought it. He should have worried about the fact that he didn't belong in a world like this. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a janitor anymore. He felt like someone who had earned his place. Miguel took a deep breath, and then he said the one word that would change his life forever. Yes, but what happened after that? No one, not even Miguel, was ready for the truth that came next. The room was still buzzing as the meeting wrapped up. Executives whispered among themselves, some still reeling from Vivian's decision, others secretly impressed by what had just happened. But Miguel was still trying to process it all. 1 minute, Miguel was a janitor. The next, he was a financial consultant at one of the most powerful corporations in the city. It didn't feel real. As the board members filed out, Vivian Lancaster remained seated, watching him with the kind of knowing look that sent a shiver down his spine. The kind that made it clear she had planned this from the start. "Walk with me." Miguel hesitated, but he followed. They stepped out of the boardroom and into the private elevator, a place he'd never even seen before, let alone been inside. The doors slid shut with a soft hum. For a moment, silence settled between them. Then Vivian spoke. "You think this was luck?" she asked, pressing the button for the top floor. Miguel shifted uncomfortably, "Wasn't it?" She let out a quiet, almost amused laugh, shaking her head. "No, Miguel, it wasn't." The elevator climbed higher. Miguel frowned. "I don't understand." Vivian turned to him, her sharp gaze pinning him in place. "I did my research," she said, "before I ever walked into that break room. Before I invited you to this meeting, I already knew everything about you." His stomach tightened. "What? I know your father owned a small business. I know you had to drop out of college when he passed away. I know you've been working jobs beneath your abilities because life didn't give you the luxury of options." Miguel swallowed hard, his fingers clenching at his sides. But Vivian wasn't finished. She continued. "I also know that for the past 3 years, you've been reading financial reports in the janitor's closet during your breaks." Vivian's voice was calm, measured. "I know you check stock trends on your phone before you clock in. And I know that every single person in this company has overlooked you until today." The weight of her words settled deep in Miguel's chest. This wasn't random. It wasn't a whim. She had been watching him. Miguel's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open, revealing something he never expected to see: Vivian's private office. A place most people in the company had only heard about, but never stepped foot in. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire room, the city skyline glowing against the evening sky. The kind of office where billion-dollar deals were made. She stepped inside, barely glancing back as she motioned for him to follow. "This company needs people who see things differently," she said, making her way toward an expansive marble desk. "People who don't just sit in meetings, nodding along to bad decisions because they're afraid to question them." She turned to face him, arms crossed. "That's why I hired you." Miguel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. Vivian tilted her head slightly. Why not? He let out a dry laugh. Because I've spent my entire life being told I wasn't someone who gets jobs like this. Her gaze sharpened. Then let me be the first to tell you were lied to. Miguel stared at her, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. She leaned back against her desk, cool and unwavering. You have two choices, she said. You can let this opportunity scare you back into playing small, or you can do what you've always done, pay attention, learn fast, and prove every single person in that boardroom wrong. He hesitated. Everything in him screamed that this wasn't his world. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about that. Then Miguel met her gaze and nodded. I'm in. Vivian Lancaster's lips curved into the smallest smirk. Good, she said, because your first official task starts tomorrow. But what happened next would test Miguel in ways he never saw coming. The next morning, Miguel walked into Lexington Corp for the first time. Not as a janitor, but as a consultant. The moment he stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor, he felt it, the stares. Some were skeptical. Some were surprised, a few even hostile. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in their eyes. But then Vivian's voice echoed in his head. You were lied to. He adjusted the brand new suit jacket that had been sent to his apartment that morning. It wasn't fancy, but it fit, and that was all that mattered. Alyssa Chun was waiting for him near the conference room. She gave him a once-over, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she handed him a thick stack of reports. Hope you're ready, she said. They won't go easy on you. Miguel took the papers, flipping through the numbers. He looked up, his gaze steady. Good, he said. I wouldn't want them to. Alyssa's lips curled just slightly, almost a smirk before she pushed open the conference room door. Inside, the executives were already seated. Martin Caldwell barely acknowledged Miguel. Richard Alden, the CFO, adjusted his glasses. All right, he said, straight to business. Lancaster wants a cost-saving strategy for logistics. Let's hear what you've got. Miguel took his seat, calm, focused. He spread his notes across the table. His heartbeat, steady. This was the moment, no more doubt. Because sometimes, the only thing separating the person sitting at the table from the one cleaning it is the chance to prove themselves. Miguel didn't get here by luck. He got here by being ready long before anyone gave him a shot. So if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, if you've ever been told you don't belong, remember this: you don't need permission to be great. You just need someone to finally notice. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and drop a comment below. Because your story, it's just getting started.